What happens when the silenced find their voice? When the powerless discover their strength? This is the story of Sarah Mae Johnson, a woman who transformed pain into purpose and memory into justice. But this isn't just a tale of revenge. It's the epic journey of how one woman's quest for justice reshaped an entire society. Buckle up, because this incredible story of reckoning will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and the indomitable human spirit. Subscribe now. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds across 4 powerful chapters. Georgia, 1873. The morning mist clung to the red clay earth of Whitmore Plantation like the ghosts of a dying era. Sarah Mae Johnson, barely 16, moved through the cotton fields with practiced silence, her bare feet knowing every root and stone of the path she'd walked since childhood. The weight of the cotton sack across her shoulders was familiar, but today something felt different in the air, a tension that made even the mockingbirds fall silent. "You hear that, girl?" called out Thomas Whitmore, Jr., the plantation owner's son, his voice cutting through the humid air like a whip crack. "Y'all are free now, free to starve, free to wander, free to beg." His laughter was sharp, cruel, echoing across the fields where dozens of former slaves continued their work, uncertain of what freedom truly meant. "But you ain't free from consequence. You ain't free from knowing your place." Sarah Mae kept her eyes down, but her mind was recording everything. Every word, every sneer, every face of the 6 overseers who had made her life a living nightmare for as long as she could remember. There was Jake Morrison, the head overseer with his scarred hands and whiskey breath, a man who took pleasure in breaking spirits as much as bodies. Samuel Hartwell, who specialized in psychological torment, finding ways to crush hope before it could take root. The Brennan brothers, Patrick and Michael, twins who competed in cruelty like it was a sport, each trying to outdo the other in creative forms of punishment. William Crenshaw, whose cold blue eyes never showed mercy, and whose voice could freeze blood with its calculated indifference. And Marcus Delacroix, the youngest at 25, who perhaps was the worst because he had been educated in the North, knew better, but chose evil anyway, wielding his intelligence like a weapon against those who couldn't defend themselves. Each of these men had left scars on Sarah Mae's soul that ran deeper than any physical wound. Morrison had been the one to separate her from her mother when she was 8, selling the woman to a plantation in Alabama with the casual indifference of someone disposing of livestock. Hartwell had delighted in making her watch as other slaves were punished, forcing her to understand that any resistance would bring suffering not just to herself, but to those she loved. The Brennan brothers had perfected the art of humiliation, creating elaborate scenarios designed to strip away dignity piece by piece. Crenshaw had been the enforcer of the plantation's most brutal rules, the one who decided which infractions deserved the lash and which deserved worse, and Delacroix. Delacroix had been the most insidious of all, using his education and charm to manipulate, to make victims question their own worth, to convince them that their suffering was somehow deserved. "Sarah Mae," called her grandmother Mama Celia from the cabin doorway. The old woman's voice carried a note that Sarah Mae had never heard before. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. "Come here, child, we got talking to do." As Sarah Mae approached the weathered cabin that had housed 3 generations of her family, she noticed something different in her grandmother's posture, a straightness that hadn't been there yesterday, a light in her dark eyes that spoke of possibility. Mama Celia had been born into slavery, had watched her own children sold away, had endured decades of brutality with a strength that seemed almost supernatural. If anyone could navigate this new world of supposed freedom, it would be her. "Pack your things, baby girl," Mama Celia whispered, pressing a small cloth bundle into Sarah Mae's hands. The bundle was heavier than expected, and Sarah Mae could feel the outline of something metallic inside. Coins, perhaps, saved over years of impossible circumstances. "We leaving this place tonight when the moon sets, but before we go—" She gripped Sarah Mae's shoulders firmly, her weathered hands surprisingly strong. "You remember their faces, you remember their names. You remember every single thing they done to us, to our people. Justice may be slow, but it ain't blind, and it ain't forgetful." That evening, as the Johnson family prepared to leave Whitmore Plantation forever, Sarah Mae stood at the edge of the property, looking back at the big house where lamplight flickered in the windows. The overseers were inside, drinking and laughing, celebrating what they believed would be their continued dominance in a new world. Their voices carried on the night air, boastful and crude, making plans for how they would maintain control, even without the legal framework of slavery to support them. "We'll use the black codes," she heard Crenshaw saying, his voice carrying clearly through an open window. "Keep them in line through debt, through fear, through whatever means necessary. Freedom on paper don't mean freedom in practice." "The girls got spirit," Morrison's voice added, and Sarah May knew they were talking about her. "Might be worth keeping an eye on that one. Spirit like that can be dangerous if it ain't properly managed." Sarah May felt something harden inside her chest, a crystallization of resolve that would define the rest of her life. She reached into the cloth bundle her grandmother had given her and pulled out a small piece of paper and a stub of pencil, precious items that Mama Celia had somehow acquired and hidden over the years. By moonlight, she wrote 6 names: Jake Morrison, Samuel Hartwell, Patrick Brennan, Michael Brennan, William Crenshaw, Marcus Delacroix. Under each name, she wrote a single word: remember. "I'll remember," she whispered to the Georgia wind, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into her dress. "Every single one of you. I'll remember, and someday you'll answer for what you've done." The journey north began that night, a dangerous trek through a landscape still hostile to black travelers, even free ones. Mama Celia had connections. Former slaves who had escaped years earlier, abolitionists who ran safe houses, conductors on what remained of the Underground Railroad. The journey took 3 weeks, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day, always listening for the sound of pursuit that never came but always seemed possible. During those long nights of walking, Mama Celia told Sarah May stories, not just family stories, but stories of resistance, of slaves who had fought back, of communities that had protected each other, of the long history of struggle that had led to this moment of fragile freedom. "Your great-grandmother, she could read," Mama Celia whispered as they walked along a moonlit road in Tennessee. "Taught herself from scraps of newspaper, from the Bible when she could get hold of it. She used to say that knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take away from you, not if you hid it deep enough in your mind." "What happened to her?" Sarah May asked. "She taught others, secretly, carefully, but she taught them. And when the master found out—" Mama Celia's voice trailed off, but Sarah May understood. "But the knowledge lived on. It always does. That's why you got to learn everything you can, baby girl. Education is the only weapon they can't take away from you." Boston, Massachusetts, 1875-1883. The North was a revelation that exceeded even Sarah May's most optimistic dreams. Boston in 1875 was a city transformed by the war, a place where the ideals of abolition had taken root and flourished into something approaching true equality. Here, Sarah May discovered a world where her mind was valued, where education wasn't forbidden, where a young black woman could dream beyond mere survival. The Freedmen's School on Beacon Hill became her second home. The building itself was a converted mansion, donated by a wealthy abolitionist family, its high ceilings and tall windows, a stark contrast to the cramped quarters she had known on the plantation. Her first teacher was Miss Elizabeth Warren, a white woman from Connecticut who had dedicated her life to educating former slaves. "Miss Johnson," Miss Warren said during Sarah May's first week, "you have a remarkable mind. Have you had any formal education before?" "No, ma'am," Sarah May replied, still adjusting to being addressed with respect. "But my great-grandmother taught my grandmother to read, and she taught me. We had to hide it, but we learned." Miss Warren's eyes filled with tears. "Then we have much work to do, and I suspect you'll be teaching me as much as I teach you." The curriculum was rigorous: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and something Sarah May had never encountered before: philosophy. She devoured every book she could find, staying late into the evening in the school's library, reading by lamplight until her eyes burned. But it was in her history classes that Sarah May found her true calling, learning about the legal frameworks that had supported slavery, the constitutional compromises that had perpetuated it, the court cases that had both upheld and eventually challenged it, All of this filled her with a burning desire to understand the law, not just as it was, but as it could be. The law, explained Professor James Mitchell during a lecture on constitutional history, is not a fixed thing. It evolves, it changes, it responds to pressure from those who demand justice. The same legal system that once upheld slavery was eventually used to abolish it. The question is, who will shape its future evolution? Sarah May raised her hand. Professor Mitchell, how does someone become a lawyer? The question caused a stir in the classroom. In 1876, there were perhaps a dozen black lawyers in the entire United States, and no black women lawyers at all. But Professor Mitchell took the question seriously. It requires dedication, Miss Johnson. Years of study, apprenticeship with an established lawyer, and eventually admission to the bar. It's a difficult path for anyone, and particularly challenging for someone in your circumstances. But not impossible, Sarah May pressed. No, Professor Mitchell said slowly. Not impossible. Difficult, but not impossible. That conversation changed the trajectory of Sarah May's life. She began focusing her studies specifically on subjects that would prepare her for legal education: Latin, rhetoric, logic, and most importantly, a deep study of American legal history. She read every law book she could find, often borrowing them from sympathetic professors at Harvard Law School who were impressed by her dedication. Her transformation wasn't just intellectual, it was complete. She learned to speak with the refined accent of educated Boston society, studying the speech patterns of her teachers and the wealthy families who supported the school. She learned to dress appropriately for different social situations, understanding that appearance could be as important as intelligence in gaining access to opportunities. She learned the subtle social codes that governed interactions in polite society, the unspoken rules that could make the difference between acceptance and rejection. But perhaps most importantly, she learned patience. Revenge is a dish best served cold, she would tell herself, practicing the phrase in her mirror each morning as she prepared for another day of classes. But justice is a feast that feeds the soul, and it requires careful preparation. By 1878, Sarah May had completed her basic education and was ready for college. Through the sponsorship of the Boston Anti-Slavery Society, she was accepted to Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions in the country that welcomed students regardless of race or gender. Oberlin was another revelation. Here, she studied alongside white students, black students, men and women, all treated as intellectual equals. Her professors challenged her thinking, pushed her to develop her own ideas, and encouraged her to see herself not just as a student, but as a future leader. Miss Johnson, said Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, no relation to the overseer Samuel Hartwell, though the name always made Sarah May's jaw tighten. Your essay on legal reform is exceptional. Have you considered law school? Sarah May had indeed considered it. Every night, as she studied by candlelight in her small dormitory room, she thought about the law, how it had failed to protect her, how it could be wielded as a weapon for justice, how knowledge could become power in the hands of someone who understood both its potential and its limitations. I have, Professor Hartwell, but I'm not sure any law school would accept a black woman. Boston University might, Professor Hartwell said thoughtfully. They've been more progressive than most, and I happen to know the dean. Would you like me to write a letter of recommendation? The application process was grueling. Sarah May had to take examinations in Latin, logic, rhetoric, and legal history. She had to write essays demonstrating her understanding of constitutional law, contract law, and legal procedure. Most challenging of all, she had to appear before a panel of professors for an oral examination that lasted 3 hours. Miss Johnson, said Dean William Richardson during that examination, why do you want to study law? Sarah May had prepared for this question, but when the moment came, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from her prepared notes. Because the law has power, sir. The power to protect or to oppress, to liberate or to enslave, to create justice or to perpetuate injustice. I want to understand that power, to master it, and to use it to ensure that what happened to my people never happens again to anyone. There was a long silence in the room. Finally, Dean Richardson nodded. That's a worthy goal, Miss Johnson. We'll be in touch. The acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later. Sarah May read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. She was going to law school. She was going to become a lawyer. She was going to have the tools she needed to seek justice. But even as she celebrated this victory, she never forgot her ultimate goal. She began her research methodically, using her connections in Boston's abolitionist community to gather information about her former tormentors. Through letters to contacts in Georgia, newspaper clippings, and careful inquiries, she tracked the lives of the 6 men who had made her childhood a nightmare. Jake Morrison had indeed become the sheriff of Whitmore County, using his position to maintain the old order through intimidation and selective enforcement of the law. Samuel Hartwell had parlayed his overseer experience into a successful business career, owning 3 stores in town and a cotton gin that employed dozens of black workers under conditions that differed little from slavery. The Brennan brothers had pooled their resources to start a cotton brokerage, using their knowledge of local farmers and their willingness to use underhanded tactics to build a thriving business. William Crenshaw had entered politics, serving first as a county commissioner and then winning election to the state legislature on a platform of maintaining order and tradition. And Marcus Delacroix had used his education and family connections to become first a prosecutor, then a judge, wielding the power of the law itself to maintain white supremacy. They had all prospered in the post-war South, their crimes forgotten by a society eager to move on, their victims scattered to the winds or silenced by fear and poverty. But Sarah May remembered everything. And now she was learning how to use that memory as a weapon. Law school was the most challenging thing Sarah May had ever attempted. The coursework was demanding. The professors were skeptical of her abilities, and her fellow students ranged from supportive to openly hostile. She was one of only 3 women in her class, and the only person of color, making her a constant target of attention and scrutiny. "Miss Johnson," Professor Adams said during her first-year contracts class, "perhaps you could explain the doctrine of consideration." It was a test, Sarah May knew. Professor Adams was known for trying to embarrass students he didn't think belonged in law school. But Sarah May was prepared. "Consideration is the exchange of something of value that makes a contract legally binding," she replied confidently. "It can be money, goods, services, or even a promise to refrain from doing something one has a legal right to do. Without consideration, a contract is merely a gift promise and generally unenforceable at law." Professor Adams nodded grudgingly. "Correct. And can you give me an example of when consideration might be found insufficient?" "Certainly. In the case of nominal consideration, for instance, selling a house worth $10,000 for $1, courts might find the consideration inadequate and refuse to enforce the contract, particularly if there's evidence of fraud or duress." From that day forward, Professor Adams treated Sarah May with the respect she had earned. But the real test came in her 2nd year, when she took Professor Williams' course on constitutional law. "Today we'll be discussing the Dred Scott decision," Professor Williams announced. "Miss Johnson, since you have a particular perspective on this case, perhaps you'd like to begin our discussion." The classroom fell silent. Sarah May felt the weight of every eye upon her, knew that her response would determine how she was viewed not just by her professor, but by her classmates. She took a deep breath and stood. "The Dred Scott decision represents one of the most shameful moments in the history of American jurisprudence," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Chief Justice Taney's opinion that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect was not just morally reprehensible, it was legally indefensible. The decision ignored the plain language of the Constitution, dismissed the clear intent of the founders regarding citizenship, and created a legal fiction designed to perpetuate an economic system built on human bondage." She paused, looking around the room at her classmates' faces. Some shocked, some impressed, some clearly uncomfortable. "But more than that," she continued, "Dred Scott demonstrates the danger of allowing personal prejudice to masquerade as legal principle. When judges abandon their duty to interpret law fairly and instead use their power to advance a particular social agenda, they undermine the very foundation of our legal system." The decision was eventually overturned not just by the Civil War, but by the recognition that law must serve justice, not the other way around. When she finished, the classroom remained silent for a long moment. Then Professor Williams began to clap, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Soon the entire class was applauding. "Excellent analysis, Miss Johnson," Professor Williams said. "You've identified the key issue, the relationship between law and justice, and the responsibility of those who interpret law to serve the cause of justice rather than their own prejudices." That moment marked a turning point in Sarah May's law school experience. Her classmates began to see her not as an oddity or an intruder, but as a serious scholar whose insights enriched their understanding of the law. Her professors began to rely on her contributions to class discussions, and several began mentoring her in preparation for her eventual career. But perhaps the most important relationship she developed was with Professor Margaret Foster, one of the few women on the law school faculty. Professor Foster taught a seminar on legal strategy and advocacy, and she took a special interest in Sarah May's development. "You have a gift," Professor Foster told her after class one day, "not just for understanding the law, but for seeing how it can be used as a tool for social change. Have you thought about what kind of law you want to practice?" "Civil rights," Sarah May replied without hesitation. "I want to use the law to protect people who can't protect themselves." "That's admirable," Professor Foster said, "but it's also dangerous, particularly in the South. You'll be challenging powerful interests, people who have a lot to lose if the legal system truly becomes fair and equal." "I know," Sarah May said, "but that's exactly why it needs to be done." Professor Foster studied her for a long moment. "There's something else, isn't there? Something personal driving this passion for justice." Sarah May hesitated, then decided to trust her mentor with the truth. She told Professor Foster about her childhood on the plantation, about the 6 men who had tormented her and her family, about the promise she had made to seek justice. "I see," Professor Foster said when Sarah May finished her story, "and you plan to return to Georgia to confront these men?" "I plan to return to Georgia to practice law," Sarah May corrected. "If that brings me into contact with certain individuals from my past, well, justice has a way of finding those who deserve it." Professor Foster was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah May, I'm going to give you some advice that may sound contradictory. First, never let your personal feelings cloud your professional judgment. The law is most powerful when it's applied dispassionately, objectively, without regard to personal grievances. Second, never forget that the law is ultimately about human beings, their suffering, their hopes, their need for justice. The tension between those two principles will define your career." "How do I balance them?" Sarah May asked. "By remembering that true justice serves not just the individual but society as a whole. When you seek justice for yourself, make sure you're also seeking it for everyone who has suffered similar wrongs. That way, your personal quest becomes something larger, something that can change the world." Those words would guide Sarah May through the final years of her legal education and beyond. She threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose, not just learning the law, but understanding how to use it strategically, how to build cases that would not only win in court, but create precedents that would protect others. In her final year, she wrote a law review article titled "The Constitutional Foundations of Civil Rights, a Framework for Post-Reconstruction Legal Strategy." The article outlined a comprehensive approach to using the 14th and 15th Amendments to challenge discriminatory laws and practices throughout the South. It was published in the Boston University Law Review and was widely read by lawyers and judges throughout the country. "This is groundbreaking work," Professor Foster told her. "You're not just analyzing existing law, you're creating a roadmap for future legal challenges. This could be the foundation for decades of civil rights litigation." At her graduation ceremony in 1883, Sarah May stood before the mirror in her boarding house, adjusting her cap and gown. She was one of only 3 women in her class and the only person of color, but she had graduated summa cum laude with the highest grades in constitutional law and legal advocacy. "Time to go home," she said to her reflection, thinking of the 6 names she still carried in her memory. Time for the reckoning. But first, she had one more stop to make. She had been offered a position with a prestigious Boston law firm, a chance to build a comfortable career representing wealthy clients in commercial disputes. It was a safe choice, a path that would bring her respect and financial security. Instead, she turned it down. "I'm going to start my own practice," she told the senior partner who had made the offer. "In Georgia, there are people there who need legal representation. People who have been ignored by the legal system for too long." "That's ambitious," the partner said carefully, "and dangerous. Are you sure you want to throw away this opportunity?" "I'm not throwing it away," Sarah May replied. "I'm investing it in something more important than my own comfort. I'm investing it in justice." Whitmore County, Georgia, 1884. Sarah May returned to Georgia, not as the broken girl who had fled 11 years earlier, but as attorney Sarah M. Johnson, Esquire, representing the newly formed Southern Justice Coalition, a legal aid organization funded by Northern philanthropists and dedicated to protecting the rights of former slaves. The transformation was so complete that she might have been a different person entirely, were it not for the memories that burned as brightly as ever in her mind. She established her practice in the county seat of Millerville, just 20 miles from the old Whitmore plantation, in a building that had once housed slave auctions. The irony was not lost on her. Where human beings had once been bought and sold like livestock, she would now fight for their rights as citizens. The building itself required extensive renovation, but Sarah May saw potential in its high ceilings and large windows. With funding from her northern supporters, she transformed it into a modern law office, complete with a library, conference rooms, and space for the staff she planned to hire. The reaction to her arrival was immediate and intense. The local newspaper, the Millerville Gazette, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Carpetbagger Lawyer Comes to Town," describing her as an outside agitator seeking to disrupt the natural order of our community. The article was written by Samuel Hartwell's nephew, a detail that Sarah May noted with grim satisfaction. But not all the reaction was negative. Within days of opening her office, Sarah May was visited by a steady stream of black residents seeking legal help. Sharecroppers cheated out of their wages, families whose land had been stolen through fraudulent legal maneuvers, workers injured in unsafe conditions with no recourse for compensation. Each case was a window into the systematic oppression that had replaced slavery, a carefully constructed legal framework designed to maintain white supremacy while technically complying with federal law. Her first major case came sooner than expected. A young black man named Thomas Washington had been arrested for allegedly stealing a horse from William Crenshaw's property. The evidence was thin. No witnesses, no physical proof, just Crenshaw's word against Washington's. But in Whitmore County, that was usually enough to secure a conviction. "They gonna hang me, Miss Johnson," Washington told her during their first meeting in the county jail. "Mr. Crenshaw, he say he saw me with his horse, and that's all the jury gonna need to hear." Sarah May studied the case file, noting the inconsistencies in Crenshaw's story, the lack of proper investigation, the rush to arrest and prosecute. It was a perfect example of how the legal system was being used to maintain control over the black population. "They're not going to hang you, Thomas," she said firmly. "We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." The case brought Sarah May directly into contact with Sheriff Jake Morrison for the first time since her return. When she walked into his office to review the evidence, she could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in his bloodshot eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair with a cruel smile. "Little Sarah May, all grown up and playing dress-up, I see." Sarah May set her leather briefcase on his desk with deliberate precision, her movements calm and controlled, despite the rage burning in her chest. This was the man who had separated her from her mother, who had delighted in breaking up families, who had used his position of power to inflict maximum suffering on those who couldn't fight back. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, her voice professionally cool, "how nostalgic to see you again. I'm here about the Washington case. I trust you'll provide me with all the evidence you've collected?" Morrison's face reddened, the same flush she remembered from his drinking binges on the plantation. "Now you listen here, girl." "Attorney Johnson," she corrected smoothly, pulling out a legal pad and pen. "And I'm listening very carefully, Sheriff, to everything. Please proceed with your report on the investigation." The next hour was a masterclass in professional intimidation. Sarah May asked detailed questions about every aspect of the investigation, taking careful notes, requesting documentation that Morrison clearly didn't have, pointing out procedural irregularities with the polite persistence of someone who knew the law better than he did. "Oh, you think you're real smart, don't you?" Morrison snarled as she prepared to leave. "Coming back here with your fancy education, thinking you can change things. This is still Georgia, Sarah May. We got ways of dealing with troublemakers." Sarah May paused at the door, turning back to face him with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Sheriff Morrison, I'm sure you do have your ways, but I have mine as well, and I think you'll find that the law properly applied is quite effective at dealing with corruption and abuse of power." The Washington trial became a sensation. The courthouse was packed every day, with black residents filling the gallery to watch Sarah May systematically dismantle the prosecution's case. She called witnesses who testified to Washington's whereabouts at the time of the alleged theft. She presented evidence that Crenshaw's horse had been found grazing in a field miles from where Washington was arrested. Most damaging of all, she revealed that Crenshaw owed Washington money for work performed and had refused to pay. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah May said in her closing argument, "this case is not about a stolen horse. It's about a system that allows a white man to use the power of the law to avoid paying his debts to a black man. It's about whether we will allow our courts to be used as instruments of oppression, or whether we will demand that justice be truly blind." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the black gallery, while the white section sat in stunned silence. It was the first time in living memory that a black defendant had been acquitted in a case where a white man was the accuser. But Sarah May's victory came at a cost. That night, someone threw a brick through the window of her office with a note attached. "Go back where you came from or you'll regret it." She was examining the damage the next morning when she received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Delacroix, now Judge Delacroix, stood in her doorway, impeccably dressed as always, his handsome face wearing an expression of concern that she knew was completely false. "Miss Johnson," he said, stepping carefully around the broken glass, "I heard about this unfortunate incident. I want you to know that this kind of lawlessness has no place in our community." Sarah May looked up from her desk, where she was cataloguing the damage for her insurance claim. Here was the man who had perhaps hurt her most deeply, not through physical violence, but through psychological manipulation, through making her question her own worth and dignity. He looked older now, lines around his eyes and grey threading through his dark hair, but he still carried himself with the same arrogant confidence that had made him so dangerous. "Judge Delacroix," she replied evenly, "how kind of you to express concern, though I have to wonder why you didn't show similar concern for justice during the Washington trial." Delacroix's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning." "Of course you don't," Sarah May said, standing and moving to face him directly. "Tell me, Judge, do you remember a little girl on the Whitmore plantation? A girl you used to counsel about knowing her place in the world?" The color drained from Delacroix's face as recognition finally dawned. "Sarah May," he whispered. "Attorney Johnson," she corrected, just as she had with Morrison. "And yes, I remember our conversations very well. Every word, every lesson you taught me about power and powerlessness, I found them quite educational." Delacroix recovered his composure quickly, but Sarah May could see the fear in his eyes. I hope you understand that those were different times. We were all products of a system that you helped to maintain," Sarah May interrupted. "That you chose to participate in even when you knew better. But you're right about one thing. Times have changed. And I think you'll find that the lessons you taught me about power have been very well learned indeed." After Delacroix left, Sarah May sat alone in her damaged office, surrounded by broken glass and the smell of fear. She had fired the first shot in what she knew would be a long war, and her enemies were already responding. But she was ready for whatever came next. Her next target was Samuel Hartwell, whose businesses had prospered through questionable government contracts and exploitative labor practices. Sarah May began representing a group of workers at Hartwell's Cotton Gin who were seeking fair wages and safe working conditions. What she discovered during her investigation was a system of debt peonage that effectively re-enslaved black workers through a combination of inflated prices at the company store, arbitrary fines and deductions, and contracts written in language designed to confuse and deceive. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah May said during a deposition at his lawyer's office, "can you explain why your workers are charged 50 cents for a loaf of bread that cost 20 cents at the general store?" Hartwell, now in his 50s and grown fat on his ill-gotten gains, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We provide convenience and credit. That comes at a cost." "I see. And the housing you provide. Can you describe the conditions?" "Adequate for their needs." Sarah May pulled out a folder of photographs she had taken of the workers' quarters. Ramshackle buildings with leaking roofs, broken windows, and no running water. "Would you consider these conditions adequate for your own family, Mr. Hartwell?" "That's different. These people are used to what, Mr. Hartwell? To being treated as less than human, to living in conditions that would be condemned if they housed animals." Hartwell's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Sarah May had what she needed: evidence of systematic exploitation that violated both state and federal labor laws. But more than that, she had uncovered Hartwell's involvement in the convict leasing system, a practice that allowed private companies to lease prisoners from the state for labor. The prisoners, mostly black men convicted of minor offenses or trumped-up charges, were worked under conditions that made slavery look humane. Many died from overwork, disease, or accidents, their deaths covered up by corrupt officials who profited from the system. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Hartwell snarled during a break in the deposition, his face twisted with rage. "Coming back here with your fancy education, thinking you can change things. This is still the South, Sarah May. We remember our place here, and we remember yours." "Oh, Mr. Hartwell," Sarah May replied, her voice honey-sweet, "I remember my place perfectly. And more importantly, I remember yours. Every detail of it, every cruel word, every arbitrary punishment, every moment when you chose to inflict suffering simply because you could." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "But here's what you don't understand. I'm not that powerless little girl anymore. I have tools now, weapons you can't take away from me. And I'm going to use them to tear down everything you've built on the foundation of other people's suffering." The convict leasing scandal broke in the Atlanta Constitution 6 months later, based on evidence that Sarah May had carefully compiled and leaked to sympathetic journalists. The story detailed the horrific conditions in the labor camps, the corruption that allowed the system to flourish, and the specific companies that profited from what amounted to slavery by another name. Hartwell's businesses collapsed overnight as northern investors pulled their funding and federal investigators launched a criminal probe. He fled Georgia to avoid prosecution, abandoning his property and leaving behind dozens of workers without pay. 2 down, 4 to go. The Brennan brothers proved to be more challenging targets. Patrick and Michael had built their cotton brokerage through a combination of legitimate business acumen and underhanded tactics, and they were careful to keep their illegal activities well hidden. But Sarah May was patient, methodical, and had learned to think like her enemies. She began by representing small farmers who claimed they had been cheated by the Brennan Cotton Exchange. Each case seemed minor on its own, a few cents per pound here, a disputed weight measurement there, but together they revealed a pattern of systematic fraud. "The scales are rigged," one farmer told her. "I know what my cotton weighs, but somehow it always comes up short when the Brennans measure it." Sarah May hired an independent inspector to examine the scales at the Brennan facility. What he found was a sophisticated system of weighted levers and hidden mechanisms that could reduce the apparent weight of cotton by up to 10%. The fraud had been going on for years, stealing thousands of dollars from farmers who had no recourse against the powerful brothers. But the scale fraud was just the beginning. As Sarah May dug deeper, she uncovered evidence of price manipulation, bribery of railroad officials to secure favorable shipping rates, and most damaging of all, a scheme to buy cotton from farmers at artificially low prices by spreading false rumors about market conditions. The Brennan brothers' downfall came not through a dramatic courtroom confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence that made their guilt undeniable. Sarah May filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of more than 200 farmers, seeking damages for fraud and racketeering. The case attracted national attention as an example of how the legal system could be used to protect small farmers from corporate exploitation. "We built this business with our own hands," Patrick Brennan protested during his deposition. "We never broke any laws." "Mr. Brennan," Sarah May replied, consulting her notes, "are you familiar with the federal statute regarding mail fraud? Because I have here copies of letters you sent to farmers containing false information about cotton prices, sent through the United States mail for the purpose of defrauding those farmers." The brother's lawyer whispered urgently in Patrick's ear, but it was too late. The admission was on the record, and Sarah May had the evidence to back it up. The Brennan Cotton Exchange was forced into bankruptcy, its assets sold to pay damages to the farmers they had cheated. Patrick and Michael fled to Texas, their reputation destroyed and their fortune gone. 4 down, 2 to go. William Crenshaw's political career ended when Sarah May's coalition published documented proof of his involvement in voter intimidation and election fraud. The evidence included sworn affidavits from black voters who had been threatened or bribed, photographs of ballot boxes that had been stuffed with fraudulent votes, and most damaging of all, a recorded conversation in which Crenshaw discussed plans to keep the colored vote under control. The scandal reached Washington, where federal investigators were already looking into voting rights violations throughout the South. Crenshaw was forced to resign from the state legislature and faced federal charges for civil rights violations. He avoided prison only by agreeing to testify against other officials involved in the conspiracy. 5 down, 1 to go. But Marcus Delacroix, now Judge Delacroix, was her final and most challenging target. He was careful, intelligent, and had covered his tracks well. Unlike the others who had relied on brute force and obvious corruption, Delacroix used the law itself as his weapon, manipulating legal procedures and precedents to maintain white supremacy while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Sarah May knew she would need to be patient, strategic, and absolutely perfect in her approach. She began by studying every case Delacroix had presided over, looking for patterns of bias, procedural irregularities, and evidence of prejudicial rulings. What she found was a masterclass in subtle discrimination, sentences that were consistently harsher for black defendants, civil cases where white plaintiffs always seemed to prevail, and a pattern of evidentiary rulings that systematically favored white litigants. The opportunity she had been waiting for came when Delacroix was assigned to preside over a case involving the rights of black landowners whose property had been seized for unpaid taxes. The case was complex, involving questions of due process, property rights, and equal protection under the law. Exactly the kind of case where Delacroix's bias would be most difficult to hide. Sarah May appeared before his court representing the landowners, and she could see the tension in his jaw as he recognized the impossible position she had put him in. If he ruled fairly, he would be betraying everything he had worked to maintain. If he ruled based on his prejudices, she would have the evidence she needed to destroy him. "Counselor Johnson," he said carefully during the first hearing, "I believe we may have met before." "Indeed, Your Honor," Sarah May replied, standing with perfect posture, her voice carrying the authority of education and law. "Though the circumstances were quite different then, I was a child and you were, teaching me about power." The courtroom was silent, but Sarah May could feel the electricity in the air. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A former slave confronting her former oppressor in a court of law, with the power of justice on her side. The case proceeded over several weeks, with Sarah May methodically presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and building an unassailable legal argument. But more than that, she was building something else, a public record of Delacroix's bias, his attempts to manipulate proceedings, his barely concealed hostility toward black plaintiffs. Each day brought new revelations. Sarah May called witnesses who testified about Delacroix's conduct in previous cases, legal experts who explained how his rulings violated established precedent, and, most damaging of all, former court clerks who testified about his private comments regarding black litigants. "Your Honor," one clerk testified, Judge Delacroix told me that he would never let a uppity nigger win a case in his courtroom, no matter what the law said. Delacroix's face went white, but he couldn't object without confirming the testimony. Sarah May had trapped him perfectly, using his own words against him in a forum where he couldn't escape through violence or intimidation. On the final day of the trial, as Sarah May delivered her closing argument, she looked directly at Judge Delacroix and spoke words that would be remembered long after the gavel fell. "Your Honor, this case is about more than property rights or tax law. It's about whether our legal system will truly provide equal justice under law, or whether it will continue to serve as an instrument of oppression. It's about whether those who were once powerless can stand in courts like this one and demand the same rights and protections as any other citizen." She paused, her eyes never leaving Delacroix's face. "Justice is not about the past, it's about the future. It's about ensuring that the law serves all people equally, regardless of their race, their background, or their history. It's about transformation, not just of individuals, but of entire systems that once thrived on oppression." She won the case, but more importantly, the transcript of the proceedings, along with other evidence Sarah May had carefully compiled over months of investigation, found its way to the State Judicial Review Board, the Federal Department of Justice, and newspapers throughout the country. The scandal was enormous. Judge Marcus Delacroix, once considered a rising star in Georgia politics, was removed from the bench, disbarred, and faced federal charges for civil rights violations. His carefully constructed career was destroyed, his reputation in ruins, his future prospects non-existent. 6 down. Justice served. Whitmore County, Georgia, 1887-1895. Sarah May stood in the courthouse square, where a statue of a Confederate general had once dominated the landscape. In its place now stood a monument to justice, a bronze figure of a woman holding scales in one hand and a book in the other, funded by her legal victories and erected by a community that had found its voice. The inscription read simply, "Justice delayed is not justice denied." The transformation of Whitmore County had been remarkable. The 6 men who had once terrorized her and countless others were gone. Some fled, some imprisoned, some simply broken by the weight of their exposed crimes. But Sarah May had never sought their destruction for its own sake. She had sought something far more powerful, the transformation of a system. Her law practice had grown into the largest civil rights firm in the region, with offices in 3 counties and a staff of 12 lawyers, investigators, and support personnel. She had trained a new generation of black lawyers, established schools, and created a network of support that ensured no one would suffer in silence as she once had. But the work was far from over. Each victory had revealed new challenges, new forms of oppression that required new strategies to combat. The legal framework of white supremacy was like a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more would grow in its place. "Miss Sarah May," called a young voice. She turned to see a girl, perhaps 16, approaching with a book clutched to her chest. The girl's name was Rebecca Washington, the daughter of Thomas Washington, the young man whose case had been Sarah May's first major victory. "I'm starting at Spelman College next month. I wanted to thank you for making it possible." Sarah May smiled, remembering another 16-year-old girl who had once walked these same streets with nothing but pain and a promise of justice. "Remember," she told the young woman, "education is power, justice is possible, and the arc of history bends toward righteousness, but only when we have the courage to bend it ourselves." As Rebecca walked away, Sarah May reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had kept her promise to remember, but more than that, she had transformed memory into action, pain into purpose, and powerlessness into the most potent force of all, justice served with patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. But her story was not yet complete. The most challenging chapter was still to come. In 1888, Sarah May received a letter that would change everything. It was from Marcus Delacroix, writing from a federal prison in Atlanta, where he was serving a 5-year sentence for civil rights violations. "Dear Miss Johnson," the letter began, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am writing to request a meeting. There are things I need to say, things that have haunted me every day since my conviction. I understand if you refuse, but I hope you will consider it." Sarah May stared at the letter for a long time. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to let Delacroix rot in prison with his guilt and regret. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by Mama Celia's wisdom and Professor Foster's guidance, recognized an opportunity. She wrote back, agreeing to meet. The federal prison in Atlanta was a grim place, all grey stone and iron bars, filled with the echoes of despair and broken dreams. Sarah May was escorted to a small visiting room where Delacroix waited. Dressed in prison clothes, his once handsome face gaunt and aged beyond his years. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Sarah May replied, sitting across from him at the scarred wooden table. "What do you want, Marcus?" The use of his first name seemed to surprise him. "I want to apologize. I know it's inadequate. I know it can't undo the harm I caused. But I need you to know that I understand now what I was, what I did." "Do you?" Sarah May asked. "Do you really understand? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Delacroix was quiet for a long moment. "Both, I suppose. I am sorry I got caught, because prison is a terrible place and I'm afraid of what will happen to me when I get out. But I'm also sorry for what I did, for the person I was, for the pain I caused you and so many others." "Tell me about that pain," Sarah May said. "Tell me what you remember." For the next hour, Delacroix spoke about his memories of the plantation, his role in maintaining the system of oppression, his specific actions against Sarah May and her family. He spoke with a clarity and honesty that surprised her, acknowledging not just what he had done but why he had done it. The fear, the greed, the twisted sense of superiority that had driven his cruelty. "I told myself I was maintaining order," he said. "I told myself it was natural that some people were meant to rule and others to serve, but the truth is I knew it was wrong. I had been educated. I had read philosophy and law and history. I knew that what we were doing was evil, but I did it anyway because it benefited me." "And now?" Sarah May asked. "Now I know that there is no justification for what I did. No excuse, no rationalization that makes it acceptable. I participated in a system of evil, and I bear responsibility for the suffering it caused." Sarah May studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but what she saw was genuine remorse, a man who had been broken by the consequences of his actions and forced to confront the truth about himself. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "Nothing," Delacroix replied. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that your victory was complete. You didn't just destroy my career or my reputation, you forced me to see myself as I really was. And that may be the most important thing you could have done." Sarah May left the prison with much to think about. She had expected to feel satisfaction from seeing her former tormentor brought low, but instead she felt something more complex. A recognition that justice was not just about punishment, but about transformation. Over the following months, she began to develop a new understanding of her mission. It was not enough to tear down the old system of oppression. She needed to build something better in its place. And that meant not just defeating her enemies, but finding ways to redeem them, to transform them from agents of oppression into allies of justice. She began visiting other former overseers and plantation owners, not to gloat over their downfall, but to offer them a path to redemption. Some rejected her overtures, clinging to their old prejudices and resentments, but others, broken by their losses and forced to confront the consequences